Good evening. I'm Steve Zhang. I am the director of the SOAS China Institute. On behalf of SOAS, let me welcome you all to the 6th WSD Handa Distinguished Lecture at SOAS. As some of you may know, the Handa Lecture is a series of distinguished lectures by distinguished scholars or practitioners renowned for their scholarships or insights based on policymaking and engagement with some of the most important issues in the world. The lectures are not entirely always on China. It covers the areas that SOAS cover more widely, in particular over South Asia and the Middle East. For the previous distinguished Handa lecturers who spoke on China, they include Sir John Key, the former Prime Minister of New Zealand, Professor Tom Christensen of Columbia University, Tony Abbott, former Prime Minister of Australia, and Professor Barry Norton of the University of California, San Diego. This series of lectures is named after WSD and Dr. Handa. WSD stands for the Worldwide Support for Development, which is a Japan-based non-profit organization. Dr. Haruhisa Handa is a Greek philanthropist who is committed to support disadvantaged people and communities all over the world. As the most progressive of leading English universities, SOAS stands in the forefront in promoting the understanding of the subjects close to the interests and heart of Dr. Handa and the remit of WSD. For today's lecture, I'm delighted to present to you Professor Yasheng Huang. Yasheng Huang is the Epoch Foundation Professor of Global Economics and Management at MIT and one of the most respected economists working on China. He is, I would say, that an economist who is also always paying a lot of attention to history and to politics, and therefore has a, if you like, somewhat multidisciplinary approach to it, in addition for being a very, very distinguished economist. He had also previously served as an associate dean at the Sloan School at MIT and had taught at the University of Michigan and at the Harvard Business School. He is currently engaged in two major research projects. One is on reframing the NIDM question. It's a project that is based on a comprehensive database on China's historical innovations. The other project is a large-scale, multidisciplinary one working on food security in China. He has published very widely, including 7 books in English and 6 in Chinese. I would only highlight 2 of the English books. One is The Rise and Fall of the East, How Exams, Autocracy, Stability, and Technology brought China success, and why they might lead to its decline, which was published in 2023 and was selected by Foreign Affairs as the best book of the year for 2023. The other one is Capitalism with Chinese Characteristics, 2008. It was also picked as the best book for the year, but on this occasion in 2008 by The Economist. My understanding is that he's got a new book which is coming out with Cambridge University Press, which is Statism with Chinese Characteristics. His subject today for the lecture is Rethinking China's Growth Model. From the books that I have mentioned, I think you can see why he is particularly well suited for the subject that we have agreed. With that, let me hand it over to you, Professor Huang.
Thank you, Steve. Thank you for that introduction. It is a great honor of me to deliver the 2024 WSD Handa lecture. And my topic is on China's growth model. And China's economy now is very much in the news, at least in the United States. That's the case. I'm sure it is also true in Britain. And I believe that it is time for, it has been overdue, in fact, to rethink about China's growth model. In one of the books that Steve introduced, my 2008 book, published by Cambridge University Press, I was arguing for a rethinking of the China model. And at the time, I was optimistic, and I was making the argument that China needed to emphasize more, not so much GDP growth, but the growth of personal income of the Chinese households. And to my regret, since 2008, China didn't go down that path. It went on a path of investments and infrastructure and technology, industrial policy. And one can make an argument that China has succeeded in those type of investments. I would also argue it has a tremendous cost in terms of the personal income growth. So today I'm going to go into some details talking about these issues and end on another call for China to rethink its growth model. So that's roughly the outline of my lecture. It is based on the two books that Steve referenced. One is my 2023 book, The Rise of and the Fall of the East. East here is not about geography. It is about exam, autocracy, stability, and technology. So that book is divided 50-50 to history and to today. And my today's lecture is partially drawing from that book. But more heavily, the book is, the presentation is based on my 2008 book. The 2008 book is about the reform era. And I just submitted the revised version of it to the Cambridge University Press. Because of the changes in China since the publication of that book, I no longer view China today as having a capitalistic economy. So I changed the title of the book to Statism with Chinese Characteristics, from directional liberalism to China model, a history of reforms and reversals. Steve is right that I write about history, both about ancient history. So my 2023 book has a chapter on Chinese technology, and we have assembled a data set on Chinese technology going back to 2nd century BCE. Today, I'm not going to go that far back. You must be relieved to hear that. But I'm going back to 78, to the 1980s, because I believe that what happened in the 1978 and in the 1980s should be used as a benchmark to judge the subsequent developments. It's also important to go back to that part of the history of China, because in my own view, and I'm going to show you some data to illustrate that view, that was when China was politically moving in a liberal direction, and when Chinese economy not only generated the robust GDP growth, it also generated even more robust growth of personal income. Right? So that's the model that I have in mind that I believe that China should emulate. It's also a model that I have in mind that is not based on ideology, right? Western economic ideology, Western political ideology. It is based on China's own experiences, and therefore the political feasibility is substantial because China has done it itself. First, I'm going to explain exactly what is the China model. And then I'm going to talk about what's wrong with it. And then I'm going to give a brief history of the evolution of Chinese politics and economy. And then I'm going to come to today's situation. My view is that in this era of rising geopolitical tensions and the backlash against globalization in general, and backlash against China in particular, there's now a narrowing policy space for Chinese leaders how to reform and change their system. My own view is that the only economically responsible change is to go back to the 1980s, an era characterized by political reforms and the economic reforms that truly benefited the Chinese households, rather than industrial policy, technology, or massive exports to the rest of the world. Well, I put it as a question mark. 1980s was generated, the policies of 1980s were generated by Deng Xiaoping. Whether or not today China has the political will, I don't doubt that the country has the economic expertise. The issue is politics, whether or not the country has the political will to go back to the Deng era. I believe that's the best way to go forward. So let me talk about China model. What exactly is China model? And what are the main assertions of China model? So one of the assertions is that, as many of you know, China has grown massively in terms of GDP growth, averaging 8-9% a year for 30, 40 years. And one of the assertions of the China model is that China has grown its GDP without genuine private ownership, genuine financial liberalization, and political reforms and political liberalization. So this is a debated issue within academia, which is the conventional wisdom is that you need economic freedom and political freedom to grow, and yet China represents such a contrarian example of a country being able to grow without genuine private ownership, financial liberalization, and political reforms. In fact, China model will go further to argue that autocracy is good for economic growth because it reduces the coordination costs, right? So when you launch massive infrastructure programs, the thing that sometimes stops these programs is what we call hold-up cost, right? So the person that controls the land doesn't want to surrender the land, and you need the land to build a bridge. You cannot build half of the bridge. You have to build the whole bridge. But in an autocratic system, you can just simply arrest the person, right? No problem. And there's a joke that I heard in China a few years ago that a municipal, it's a joke, I cannot verify it actually happened. A mayor of the city commissioned an environmental study on the environmental impact of building the railway near the city center. So the environmental study comes back saying that it is going to have very severe negative environmental impact on the city if you go ahead with the project. The mayor takes the finding very, very seriously, and he immediately concludes that we need to move the 3 million people away from the city center in order to build the project. Right? So autocracy, can reduce the coordination costs, can evict people so that they won't be an obstacle to infrastructure projects. And effective in building infrastructure, implementing industrial policy, which power growth. Right? And also, reforms are difficult to do, right? There are always vested interests opposing reforms. There are going to be people who lose from reforms. You need a strong man, usually a strong man rather than a strong woman, to overcome the opposition, to power the reforms through the vested interests. So there's a whole theory about why autocracy is good for economic growth, why China model represents almost the ideal situation where you combine the efficiency of autocracy and the efficiency of market economy. So what's wrong with it? I mean, isn't it self-evident that the fact that China has grown 8%, 9% a year, isn't that self-evidence that autocracy has delivered economic growth? So I would argue no, that first of all, it is a wrong way to explain China's economic growth. Especially, it is a wrong way to explain the takeoff of the Chinese economy. Usually in developing economies, the thing that holds back economic growth is the takeoff. Once you have the takeoff itself will generate forces of economic growth. So many countries have troubles launching that takeoff. Once the takeoff is launched, other things are less important because economic growth generates economic growth. So it is a particularly wrong model to explain the takeoff of the Chinese economy back in the 1980s. It is inconsistent factually with many things we know and many data that we have about Chinese economy. Also, I believe it is a wrong policy model, especially today. It was never the right policy model before, but today it is especially wrong policy model for how we think about Chinese economy. I would argue many of the challenges facing Chinese economy, excess debt, debt overhang, overcapacity, low domestic consumption, many of these problems are the direct result of the China model. So to solve these problems, you need to move away from China model rather than increasing China model. It's also a wrong model for the current global environment. Right? The current global environment is characterized by geopolitical tensions, trade protectionism, and backlash against China as an economic power and as a political power. So China now has a massive overcapacity, right? Essentially, the way to absorb that capacity outside of China, there's limited capacity outside of China to do that. You really have to cultivate domestic market in order to absorb that capacity. Well, need I mention Donald Trump got elected Other than many problems, I think this is a this is a problem that many countries are going to face, including China. I'll be happy to come back to this question during the Q&A. So let me begin with the China model as a way to explain what has happened in China. Let me start from the economic side. I would argue that the Chinese economic takeoff in the 1980s, and to some extent in the 1990s, was history's most sweeping, impressive takeoff of genuine private entrepreneurship. A lot of people got this thing wrong because they have not checked the definition of private sector in China. And I have done that. I have gone through thousands of government documents, bank documents, to study the genuine nature of Chinese private enterprises and also financial policies. Most people, including many, many scholars, have not done that. And China probably undertook history's one of the largest and one of the deepest financial liberalization during its takeoff period. Right? Again, this is based on reading thousands of government documents, based on careful study of data from the 1980s. And China model talks about China's success as a result of technology and infrastructure. There's one basic problem with that explanation. Many of these technological and infrastructure successes happen 10, 20, and in some cases, 30 years after China's economic takeoff, right? So in the basic social science reasoning, to say that A is a cause of B, the minimum and the necessary condition is that A happens before B, right? This assertion does not even satisfy that minimum necessary condition to establish causality. I would actually go further. I would argue that it is the Chinese growth, it is Chinese economic success that created the successes of infrastructure and technology, rather than the other way around. Right? So if you don't distinguish these two ways of causation carefully and correctly, you draw the wrong policy conclusions. Right? Much of social science work is about identifying what is the real cause and what is the effect. If we don't draw the right conclusion, what is the real cause, then we don't draw the right policy conclusion. What's very interesting, and this is well documented in economic studies, as China became successful in technology, in infrastructure, in high-speed rails, in airport construction, highway construction, Chinese productivity began to decline rather than began to rise. Right? So this is incredibly counterintuitive. You would argue that the successes in technology, the successes in infrastructure should improve productivity rather than degrading productivity. But the fact is that when China became successful in technology, Chinese productivity began to decline as measured by what is known as total factor productivity. Right? There, not many of you are probably familiar with these studies. Right? There are hundreds of papers on this topic. And estimating TFP is not precise. It is guesswork in many cases. So they differ, these studies differ on the level of productivity growth, but they converge on the direction, which means that they converge on the fact that productivity decline began roughly around 2008. And that's exactly when China began to go very deep in industrial policy, in technology, in infrastructure. Okay? It's also a wrong explanatory model to explain politics in China. And I see, many young people probably from China in the auditorium, and many of you probably are not familiar with what happened in China in the 1980s in terms of the politics. So this is something I'm willing to say. There's not a single China model within China across different provinces, across different regions. There's also not a single China political model across time, meaning that at one point in time, China had this political model. At a different in time, China had a different political model. So this is what we say. There's tremendous heterogeneity across both time and space. And there are liberal and illiberal versions of Chinese politics. Right? Later on, I'm going to come back to define what I mean by liberal politics in the context of China. And what's very interesting is that across space in China, within China, those regions that don't practice the textbook version of China model perform the best. That is to say, those regions that have relatively weaker role of the government perform the best. Those regions that have more political reforms perform the best. Those regions that stick to the most rigidly to China model perform the worst. Okay? Today, I'm not going to go into the regional differences. What I'm going to go into is differences across different time periods. Across time, during the more liberal moments, both GDP and personal income had the strongest performance. I highlighted the word personal income rather than GDP. And this is the central point I'm making in my book, which is that most analysts only look at GDP. It is absolutely true when China, basically after Tiananmen, became more politically centralized, there's no difference in terms of GDP. Essentially, in terms of GDP, there's very little difference in the 1980s, 1990s, and 2000s until about 2016, 2015. China basically held up GDP growth around 8 or 9%. There's very little difference. But there's a massive difference in terms of personal income growth. Right? So let me just be clear about what that means. So I work for MIT, right? Steve works for SOAS, or University of London. Normally as just average people rather than as academics, we care about the paychecks from MIT and from SOAS, right? At least I care, maybe. I'm not independent wealthy, so I care about my personal paycheck. As an academic, I care about GDP, right? Most people don't care about GDP. They care about their personal paycheck. Personal income is that personal paycheck. Right? So in my book, I use personal income as a superior measure of economic performance rather than GDP. Right? So that's a big difference between my work and, I would argue, 99.9% of academic work on China. I use personal income. And there, the difference, I'm going to show you later on, the difference is substantial between the more liberal period and the more illiberal period in Chinese politics. Right? So essentially, let me just say what the difference is. During the more liberal period, the personal income of the Chinese people, the growth of the personal income of the Chinese people exceeded the GDP growth. Right? For 1% growth of the GDP growth, the personal income growth exceeds value of 1. Right? If you take the ratio, it is larger than value of 1. During the illiberal period, that ratio constantly is smaller than 1. Okay? And the difference is as large as between 40 to 60%. So there's a dramatic difference in terms of personal income when we talk about different periods of Chinese politics. And today, arguably, China now has the most illiberal political moment, right? One leader, has so much power. Even GDP began to weaken, right? At least before, GDP was quite strong. But today, GDP began to weaken. So you may legitimately ask the question, right? So what is this person talking about? This is China. When did China have liberal politics? Well, China had liberal politics in the 1980s, right? China then meaningfully moved the political system in a more liberal direction. Not a democracy for sure, right? So everything is relative. Relative to the Chinese political system that China had in the 1970s, the system they put in the 1980s was more liberal. So many people don't know this. Zhongnanhai is the seat of power of the Chinese Communist Party. It's equivalent of the White House or 10 Downing Street in UK. A section of Zhongnanhai was made open in the 1980s. Tourists could go in and visit Zhongnanhai. Right? Tens of thousands of tourists visited Zhongnanhai during the 1980s. I ask you to Google it. You will find out that information. Right? So in an effort on the part of the Chinese leadership to make Chinese politics more transparent, China abolished lifelong tenure, right? Instituted the term limit, and we know what happened to that. China established mandatory age retirement. China introduced competitive village elections. China opened up the Communist Party membership to private entrepreneurs as early as 1980. Right? China began to separate the functions of the party from the functions of the state. Chinese government took out Communist Party from the state-owned enterprises in the 1980s. And China revised the party party constitution to stipulate a separation between party and the state. In 1988, the Chinese government, Chinese Communist Party, abolished CCP branches in some ministries of the government and in the SOEs. In 1989, Zhao Ziyang, the party secretary at that time, proposed asset disclosures of the Politburo members, starting with himself. Okay? So, I can understand that, you live in a British democracy, you live in American democracy, you say, what's the big deal about these things? Right? But imagine in an autocracy in China after the Cultural Revolution, these are big deal reforms. Taiwan started out with kind of within KMT reforms like that. Also, I forgot to mention, China also began to introduce more freedom in the media. Right? The Communist Party was considering to pass a law on media, and one of the provisions was not to prevent government from excessively intervening in the state-owned newspapers. These are, to me, these are genuine reforms that China undertook. So I say remarkable 1980s, I mean, in part because I was a young person in 1980s, so I missed my youth. But there are objective reasons why I believe that 1980s was remarkable. Intellectuals criticized Deng Xiaoping by name within China. Fang Lizhi, Liu Binyan, and others criticized Deng Xiaoping by name. Try to do that today to Xi Jinping. In People's Daily, the official newspaper, sometimes the newspaper will publish two competing editorials, arguing for, arguing against on same issue. Right? Diversity was celebrated at that time in the official media. There were ideological campaigns, for sure. Right? There were two famous campaigns. But they were extremely short-lived. The one in 1983 lasted 28 days. It's called the spiritual pollution campaign, something like that, anti-spiritual pollution campaign. After the campaign was launched, Ministry of Agriculture came out and said, what's this spiritual pollution campaign? We deal with agriculture. It has nothing to do with us. And then another ministry said, what's this spiritual pollution? It really has nothing to do with us, right? The ministries took upon themselves to say, the campaign has nothing to do with us. 28 days, finished, ended. Think about today. The anti-corruption campaign is still ongoing 10 years after it began. There's a website called the Statistica, right? And sometimes we go to the website to download data. Because the China anti-corruption campaign is such a long-standing campaign, they actually established data series publishing the data on how many corrupt officials have gone to jail, like reporting on GDP data, right? So they have a yearly publication on how many officials in China have gone to jail. Think about the Zero COVID campaign. Despite the astronomical economic cost of the campaign lasted 2 to 3 years, right? The most draconian campaign lasted for almost a year, starting in Shanghai in March 2022, and then ended in December 2022, right? Despite obvious, massive economic costs, and also despite the fact that there's vaccine that was available and all of that, right? So just contrast today's politics with the politics in the 1980s. There was also gentle politics in the 1980s, right? So there were political rivalries, but not political struggles, meaning you don't go to jail because you land in political troubles. Two leaders, Hua Guofeng and Hu Yaobang, both of them were forced to resign from their positions. Hua Guofeng was forced to resign in 1980. Hu Yaobang was forced to resign in 1987. But the Chinese Communist Party kept Hua Guofeng on the Central Committee. In fact, he was the longest serving member of the Central Committee. And Hu Yaobang, they kept his membership on the Politburo. Right? Neither of them went to jail because of their politics. all of these reforms were reversed after Tiananmen. Almost each single one of them, except two. One was the term limit, and the other was the mandatory retirement age. And you know who reversed those, right? So essentially, immediately after Tiananmen, they reversed the reforms proposed by Zhao Ziyang and Hu Yaobang. And then under Xi Jinping, they reversed the political reforms put in by Deng Xiaoping, right? Deng Xiaoping put in the mandatory age requirement and the term limits. Those were reversed under Xi Jinping in 2018. But immediately after Tiananmen, they reversed every single one of the reforms put in by Hu Yaobang and Zhao Ziyang. In the 1980s, there were 5 power centers, right? In the 1990s, that was reduced to 2. I'm going to show you some data. After Tiananmen, the Communist Party decided to strengthen the position of the party secretary at the expense of other positions in the government. So I already talked about reversing all the reforms by Hu Yaobang and Zhao Ziyang. And then in 1992, the party constitution was revised to take out that provision on separating party from the government management. Zhongnanhai was closed again in November 1989, after Tiananmen. Since then, not a single tourist has been able to get into Zhongnanhai. One important institution was abolished altogether. It's called the Central Advisory Commission. I'm not going to go into the details about that institution. In my 2023 book, I spent a lot of pages talking about that institution. The brief message there is that because they abolished that institution, that enabled later leaders such as Xi Jinping to amass power. Right? So that was, I'll be happy to go into that later on. So let me show you the distribution of power in the 1980s and the distribution of the power immediately after Tiananmen. In the 1980s, there were 5 centers of power held by 5 different individuals. So this is not an institutional separation of power. So it's not like Parliament vis-a-vis the executive branch, or Congress vis-a-vis the White House and Supreme Court. This is more at the personal level. 5 different individuals held 5 different centers of power. In the 1990s, it became 2. Basically, the party secretary and the premier. So Jiang Zemin occupied 3 centers of power that were held by 3 different individuals in the 1980s. He was the president of the country, he was the party secretary of the party, and he was also the chairman of the military commission. Whereas in the 1980s, those 3 positions were held by 3 different individuals. The premier is the same, 1 person. And the Central Advisory Commission was abolished. The whole institution was abolished. So Chinese politics became more centralized. So we have a measure of centralization of power, and that measure is the number of times the names of the leaders appeared in People's Daily editorials, right? So we know People's Daily is the government newspaper, and it is representative of government opinions. Essentially, we use that number of times your name appears in the People's Daily as a measure of your power, right? In the 1980s, which is to the left of the graph, there are 3 groups of leaders: the party secretary, the premier, and the members of the Politburo, roughly there's an equal distribution of the frequency of their names in the People's Daily, right? If you look at the look at these. So this is the party secretary, the number of times. This is immediately after Tiananmen in the 1990s. It went up like that under Jiang Zemin. Went down a little bit under Hu Jintao, and you can guess who that was. Right? That was Xi Jinping. Right? So very importantly, the concentration of power, a lot of Western journalists would say, oh, the concentration of power began after Xi Jinping. It's true. It definitely happened under Xi Jinping. In fact, the bigger change is from here. If you just calculate the values of the change, the biggest change is from here, right? Rather than from here to there, right? So the big change already happened after Tiananmen. In terms of economic reforms, under the more liberal model, under the more liberal model in the 1980s, China undertook vibrant private sector development and depoliticization of the enterprise management. However, most of these reforms took place in rural China. That creates a observability problem because many of us don't know what happened in rural China. And if we don't know, we think it didn't happen, right? So Carl Sagan famously said, evidence on nothing is not evidence of nothing, right? Because we don't know, it doesn't mean it didn't happen. So this is where my contribution comes in. I went through documents after documents of that period to find out exactly what happened in the 1980s. And the other problem is that, and this is why many people don't know, even scholars don't know, because most of these reforms were reversed. China only began to get attention from academia, Chinese economy, I should say, only began to get attention from foreign Western academia in the 1990s. So we sort of assume that 1980s was a more primitive version of the 1990s, right? And Steve mentioned Barry Norton, so there's a famous view, what is known as a gradualism. China began to put in more radical reforms later than earlier. So that's kind of the prevailing view, right? In the 1990s, the reforms were more far-reaching than the 1980s. But if you look at the data, if you look at the materials carefully, in fact, in the 1980s, they undertook substantial reforms. In the 1990s, they reversed many of these reforms. China model is really a story of the 1990s. It didn't describe China in the 1980s. And China model was a product of China's turn toward illiberal politics in the 1990s. Okay? So my own contribution, this is a long introduction to my productivity, and so hopefully to get the facts right? Based on detailed archival and statistical sources, thousands of pages of government and bank documents. And these documents are easily available to everybody at Chinese University of Hong Kong and Harvard University. To my puzzle, nobody used them. I don't know why. And I also go to data on business administration, registration, and household income surveys, right? So let me quickly go through what happened in the 1980s in terms of economic reforms. Probably it was history's most impressive private sector success story. drastic poverty reduction in the 1980s, rapid income growth, mostly in rural China. But remember though, rural China was 80% of the Chinese population in the 1980s, right? Something this big affecting 80% of the population, we ought to pay attention to it. The growth driver was powered by township and village enterprises. A lot of economists, including Nobel Prize winners, believe that TVEs were public, controlled and owned by local governments. I went to the original documents, government documents, defining TVEs, and I beg to differ from these Nobel Prize economists. Let me tell you what the statistics were. In 1984, there were 12 million TVEs. Of these, 10 million, 10 out of 12. I'm not the best mathematician at MIT, but even I can get that right. 10 out of 12 million are private, straightforward private TVEs. Okay? The 2 million public TVEs were created in the 1950s. What does that mean? That means the net entry of the public TVEs in the 1980s was precisely 0. 2 million created in the 1950s, 2 million were there in the 1980s. The net entry was 0. Right? Every single one of the new entry in the 1980s was private. So China model got this basic fact wrong. Right? They would argue, oh no, China is mixed ownership, local government ownership. No. Majority of them were private sector entrepreneurial companies. In 1998, Nicholas Lardy published a book, China's Unfinished Revolution, in which he argued that the thing that China didn't do was undertaking financial reforms, financial liberalization. That is, again, a prevailing view among many academics that China never undertook financial reforms. In fact, there was substantial financial reforms, financial liberalization, but almost all of it was in rural China. And many of these reforms were supported, approved by the central leadership, including Zhao Ziyang, the premier of the country, and the head of the China's central bank. They reformed the financial system to increase loan allocation to rural entrepreneurs engaged in non-agricultural production. This is an important point, right? Which is that you never grow the GDP by only doing agriculture. So you want to facilitate transition from agriculture to industry or to service. The Chinese financial system in the 1980s was redesigned to facilitate access to bank loans and capital so that rural entrepreneurs could engage in non-agricultural activities. One of the biggest things that changed in the 1990s was that the rural financial institutions was redesigned again only to support agricultural activities, to discourage rural entrepreneurs from going into non-agricultural activities. There was a private financial, nationwide financial institution that many people probably have never heard of. It's called the Rural Credit Foundation. Purely private, 100% private. It operated in 40% of the townships in China, nationwide in scale and scope. Initially, the central bank, the PBOC, the People's Bank of China, didn't approve the Rural Credit Foundation. And the Ministry of Agriculture said, no problem, we approve the Rural Credit Foundation and make it legitimate operation. Every single one of these reforms was reversed after 1989. So the biggest, I would say, probably in human history, reversal that nobody knows about, except your speaker. And so remember, Leidy's book was published in 1998. That was the year the Chinese government banned rural finance, rural private finance. You cannot possibly claim that China never undertook financial liberalization in a year when they banned financial liberalization. They criminalized rural private finance. One of the famous cases was Sun Dawu. He was using a financing method that was commonplace in the 1980s. He was using that method in the 1990s. He was arrested and sentenced to jail in 2002 or 2003. He was released pretty quickly because of the backlash from intellectuals and lawyers. But unfortunately, in 2020, he was arrested again. And now he's sentenced to 18 years in jail. One rural entrepreneur from Wenzhou, a woman, was sentenced to death in the 1990s for running a private rural financial institution. In 1994, there was a systematic re-centralization of finance. TVEs began to struggle because of credit constraints. In the late 1990s, the entire rural financial system was about to collapse because of insolvency, right? Negative equity. In 1989, there was a big pivot, the rise of the Shanghai technocrats. Basically, China was taken over by the Shanghainese. So I was born and raised in Beijing, so I blame everything on the Shanghainese. So Zhao Ziyang advocated small government and big society. The Shanghai leaders had exactly the opposite view. They are not central planners, so I want to be very clear. They are not central planners. It's just that they put much more emphasis on urban development rather than rural development. Zhao Ziyang came from rural background, and he was very successful in solving the agricultural and rural problems. But the leaders who took over China came, almost all of them, from urban background, from state-owned enterprise background. Industrial policy, commanding heights of the economy, state capitalism, and taxing. So all these policy programs require financial resources. Where do you get financial resources? You tax agriculture, you tax rural China. This is why they reversed the rural financial reforms, because rural financial reforms gave priority to rural entrepreneurs. But the rural entrepreneurs operated simple production, service operations, not high tech, right? To the technocrats, this is a distraction from technology, from urban development. So they stop the financial flows to the countryside in order to fund technology and urban areas. So it became sort of big government, small society, and the institutional pillars of those policies were political, right? The party control, the urban bias, state finance, state-owned ownership of land assets. These are classical features of the China model, right? And the restriction of population mobility through the hukou system. The long-term consequences of that shift are substantial and consequential. Again, there's no immediate effect on GDP. until about 2016, 2015, right? But personal income of the Chinese households slowed down dramatically. Until the demographic pressures, right, the fertility rate, China basically peaked in terms of fertility rate by about 2014, 2013. So until that point, the personal income share of the GDP, what we call labor share of the GDP, declined dramatically. So essentially of 1% growth of the GDP, more of that goes to the government and the capital sector rather than to the household sector. There was overcapacity, right? This is not terribly difficult to understand. When you don't have high income growth of the Chinese households, plus that they have high savings rate, the demand coming from the household is not going to be enough to absorb the production capacity. So overcapacity built as a result of these dynamics. So let's look at what happened to the personal income growth, especially of the rural Chinese. Again, we're talking about 60, 80% of the population. It is an elasticity concept, which is that you divide the personal income growth rate per capita by the GDP per capita growth rate, right? So for 1 percentage point of the GDP growth rate, you want to know what is the percentage growth point for the personal income. In the 1980s, it's about 1.36, right? So essentially, the personal income growth was faster by about 36% as compared with the GDP growth rate. In the 1990s, it slowed down to 0.75, right? Roughly about 43, 45 percentage point decline of that elasticity measure. During the next phase, it recovered a little bit under Hu Jintao to about 0.8. Very interestingly, under Xi Jinping, it recovered to about the same level as the 1980s. In case you're very happy, let me tell you the unhappy news. That's mostly because the denominator is growing slowly. So you have the ratio increase because the GDP growth rate slowed down. That's the main reason why that ratio went up. Whereas before, during those 3 periods, the GDP growth rate didn't go down. So on the same GDP growth rate, the ratio went down. But the other, I want to be fair to the leadership in China today. Xi Jinping did transfer income to the rural households. So there's also a pickup of the rural income growth, mostly because of the income transfers, right? So it's not only because of the slowdown of the GDP growth rate. You may say, well, you're only looking at the rural population, rural income growth. What about weighted urban and rural income growth? You get the same story, right? So on the left bar represents 1980s, 1990s, 2000s. You see a little bit of pickup during the Xi Jinping era, mostly because of the income transfers. Okay? Productivity. Earlier, I made a point that China was able to grow the productivity until about 2008, even though at that time it began to slow down. The green bar, the lower portion of the bar, the blue one, represents GDP growth rate. As you can see, in the 1980s, very strong GDP productivity growth. In the 1990s, a little bit decline, but still very strong. And then it went down quite a bit. It went down even further, right? So the productivity growth, in fact, began to decline when China began to invest so much in technology and in urban areas. I'll be happy to come back and explain why China was able to continue the high productivity growth in the 1990s and early 2000s. I'll be happy to come back to that. So let me quickly conclude and draw the conclusion in light of current global environment. There's overcapacity, right? That we know. There are a lot of explanations. One is that there's lack of social safety net. The government is reluctant to make income transfers, subsidies to the enterprises. I believe that those explanations are right, but they don't explain the totality of Chinese overcapacity. In my own view, the fact that China has such a low domestic consumption share of the GDP, around 37%, in my own view, this is mostly an income story. The income of the Chinese, on average, has grown too slowly relative to GDP growth. It's not a high savings story. The reason is very simple. There are many countries in the world that don't have very strong social protection, and yet their domestic consumption as a share of the GDP is easily 60%, 70%, right? Whereas China is below 40%. So you cannot possibly say all of that is because of poor social protection. Also, to the credit to Xi Jinping and Hu Jintao, they did make income transfers to rural households, right? And yet, that was not sufficient to increase the domestic consumption, right? It's an income story, right? Unless you deal with that problem, this overcapacity is going to persist. Let me skip a few. Then the issue is, how do you deal with this income story, income problem? Almost everything that you have to do as a government to improve the household income is you have to reduce your own power. That's exactly what the leadership in the 1980s did. Small government, big society, right? That's a political problem, not an economic problem, right? Everything else that they are talking about today, stock market, technology, requires more actions by the government rather than less. Whereas in my own view, to get out of the current situation, you actually need to go in the opposite direction. And you cannot possibly hope export is going to get you out of the situation, because the global environment, unlike 2000s, is entirely different. It's much more adverse to China. So that's my view. The right policy direction for China is to return to the Deng era. And the fundamental problem with the China model is that it is an extractive model, extractive of households. And an extractive model doesn't end very well. As we know in this year's Nobel Prize winners, right? Darren Acemoglu, Simon Johnson, and James Robinson, right? Extractive model can get you some GDP growth. In the long run, it is not sustainable. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Professor Huang. If I might be, I believe the mic is not yet. Well, thank you very much, Professor Huang, for this really illuminating lecture. If I might be a bit cheeky, I might suggest that listening to your talk, I would come up with a very, very cheeky alternative title to it, which would be something like From Pain to Ping, and that is from Deng Xiaoping to Xi Jinping, with a subtitle of The Bankruptcy of the China Model. Because in a sense, you provided a very powerful exposition of why you think the so-called China model is actually problematic and holding China back. Now, if we go back to the 1970s, in the background run-up to the Deng Xiaoping reform and that important period of transformation in the 1980s. The 1970s were looking at China with an economy that was almost comparable to what you saw in North Korea then and similar to today. If we are going to see the Chinese establishment seeing the problem that you have explained, what will it take for the economies to reach before we are going to see the establishment being able and willing to make the kind of changes you are prescribing?
Yeah. So I would argue that in the 1970s, it wasn't mainly because the Chinese economy was like North Korea that motivated the leadership to undertake substantial reforms. And this is where the political psychology comes in. Remember Cultural Revolution. Cultural Revolution destroyed the Chinese economy. It also destroyed the Chinese political elites, right? So the political elites that came into power after Cultural Revolution had really the most, I would argue, most correct view of what went wrong under Mao Zedong. They believe it was the over-centralization of power that created the conditions for Cultural Revolution. They obviously criticized Mao Zedong himself, but it was really the conditions and the design of the system that allowed Mao to launch the Great Leap Forward, anti-rightist campaign, and the Cultural Revolution. So the leaders then gave a lot of credit to Deng Xiaoping and Chen Yun and others. They really wanted to redistribute power in such a way another Cultural Revolution will not come back. After Tiananmen, they completely forgot that lesson. They re-centralized the politics, right? And in part because they believed that Jiang Zemin was weak. He didn't have a lot of power base in Beijing, so they needed to strengthen his power. Right? So I would argue that market economics is actually a result of that political decision to decentralize politics. It kind of happened almost organically rather than designed by the leadership. The Chinese leaders then, none of them went to the West to study Western economics, right? Very few of them got university degrees. So it wasn't like other developing countries when they put in radical market reforms based on training in economics. It was really just you let local governments, you let entrepreneurs have more power, and that empowered them to do the common sense things, such as more market development, such as more private sector development, right? So I don't worry about that development because I think I can also say that, China has a long history of entrepreneurship, commerce, and I never worry about Chinese being less entrepreneurial. I actually worry that sometimes they're too entrepreneurial, right? So I don't really worry about that. But the issue is that they have to have sufficient political space. They have to have sufficient political safety to undertake these reforms. And this is what China today doesn't have.
Well, thank you very much for that. The floor is opened. If you would like a question to catch my eye, and one of the student ambassadors will give you the microphone. If you could start off by saying who you are, it will give the speakers a sense of where the question comes from. I have that hand up there first.
Yes, Professor Huang, thank you for your talk. I'm a Hong Konger working in London. My question is about, I noticed you didn't mention roles played by international relations during that time, especially 80s. For instance, the ROC relations with the US and the technology transfer, interest-free loans provided by Japan, and of course the WTO membership. You didn't mention them at all. So I wonder, are all these, what significance are these, if any, comparing with what you have mentioned about this liberalization? Thank you.
Yeah, so I didn't mention some of them because they didn't happen in the 1980s. WTO happened in 2001. There was official aid to China in the 1980s, but if you look at the, as a share of the Chinese economy, as a share of the Chinese fixed asset investment, foreign investments was a very small part of the Chinese economic development in the 1980s. China in the 1980s incurred a current account deficit every year except 1 year. And so essentially it didn't grow because of the exports. It actually had trade deficit every year except for 1 year, right? So those things didn't really contribute. In terms of the totality of their importance on Chinese growth, they didn't really contribute that much to Chinese growth. WTO is incredibly important. So I didn't mention, not because I didn't think it was important. Hong Kong actually is also very important. We can come back to that. What WTO did was, and to some extent globalization did in the 1990s, was to some extent explain the productivity growth in the 1990s and 2000s. When the leaders in the 1990s reversed financial reforms, that policy reversal reduced the rural income growth and therefore reduced the demand from the domestic households. But the globalization provided access to high income markets of the West, right? The difference between that and the 1980s is that in the 1980s, essentially you had low level of the income, right? Rural Chinese, the level of the income was very low, but the growth was tremendous, averaging more than 10% a year for many years in the 1980s. In the 1990s and since WTO, China had this incredible access to Western markets, incredibly high level of the income, but low growth, right? So essentially this switch between sort of low income, high growth, and the high income, low growth gave the economy basically similar effect on productivity, right? So China didn't suffer because of, in terms of productivity, it didn't suffer. It kind of, so the way I describe globalization is that it made up for some of the problems in the Chinese economy, within Chinese economy, because of the low income growth, rather than adding to the Chinese economy. So it's more like ameliorative rather than additional to the Chinese economy. So if you look at the GDP growth, there's really not a much difference between the 1980s and the 1990s and 2000s. Another policy change happened after 2008. So this time around, because of the global financial crisis, the Chinese leaders correctly or incorrectly concluded that they couldn't rely on external market to the same extent that they did before. So if you look at the current account surpluses, it went down tremendously after that. But they didn't quite go back to the 1980s model, which was to empower the Chinese households. What they did was they adopted real estate. And that strategy was extremely capital intensive, required a lot of debt. And this is where we are now, right? Real estate boom coming to an end, the debt overhang, right? Without sufficient domestic capacity to absorb the difference.
The lady in front.
Thank you, Professor Huang. I'm a student here. My name is Sunny. I'm the first year social anthropology, first year PhD student. I'm very excited to see you here. I have a question about this growth story, because most growth story about China is focused on particular region in Pearl data region and the East Coast. I wonder what's your view of the western part, because I'm from Sichuan. I'm wondering what's your view on the regional differences in this growth story? Thank you.
So it is true that a lot of the growth is in the eastern part of the country, and that benefited from the globalization strategy policies that the leadership in the 1990s put in. The western part, so there was recognition that the western part was not growing as fast. And the policy at one point was to use the eastern part of the growth to benefit the western part, mostly through resource transfer policies, right? Energy, electricity, essentially a lot of these western regions generated resources, and then the resources will be used in the eastern part to grow the export industry, to grow the car industry, and maybe later on real estate. I think that the western part of China, not completely, but partially is suffering from what is known as a Dutch disease, right? So essentially they overdevelop in these energy-intensive sectors, and essentially they gave the manufacturing sector mostly to the eastern part because it was export-oriented. And one of the effects of the change from the 1980s to the 1990s was that if you look at the 1980s, the growth was very even across China. Eastern part grew, western part also grew, even northeast, Dongbei, was also growing very robustly. And in the bank documents, I found the evidence that places like Jilin and Liaoning had vibrant private sector growth, had vibrant private sector finance. A lot of the early entrepreneurs in Shenzhen came from Northeast, right? As a result of the restrictions, so one of the things, okay. So in my book, I have a table showing that the TVEs were growing in the 1980s most strongly in the least developed regions of the country. So this is western part, this is Hebei, middle part of the country. Because they switched the policy in the 1990s, the TVEs began to deteriorate in terms of their financial situation, in terms of their sales. That affected the growth rate of the less developed regions most immediately. And then the government tried to use, the leadership in the 1990s, tried to use this resource policy to compensate for the slowdown of the TVE growth, with some success, I would argue. But my worry is that this is a resource transfer story rather than a long-term growth story. And Dongbei today is in a very bad situation.
Could a gentleman at the back?
Okay.
Thank you very much. Very, very stimulating. I remember reviewing your 2008 book and being quite blown away by it. I have just one comment on your fascinating indicators of the changing political situation. The sector that you didn't mention at all is the one that I follow most closely, organised intellectual life. In the two big academies, and most interestingly of all, in Peking University, still sort of presided over by old Hao Ping, the historian himself.
Yeah.
I was reading the 7-chapter account of the history of Peking University, which was on their website. I was about 2/3 of the way through it, and I went back to it. It vanished, completely vanished. And that was literally days after Xi Jinping's comments on history. Just vanished. And it was replaced initially by a sentence, or a sentence and a half, just nothing at all, really, because they didn't know what to put in. And the other thing, a bit later, that was expanded to a sort of paragraph. And I don't know what it is today, I haven't looked more recently. But the way that that whole story in 7 chapters disappeared was incredible, absolutely incredible. And you can also study the leadership and the activities of both the CAS with 1S and with 2 S's. And they're so revealing, especially if you went right back to the 80s. But our current 2 decades tells you an enormous amount, enormous.
Thank you, Chris Howe.
I completely agree with you. The 1980s, the intellectual environment was incredible. You know, a lot of people don't get that because their view of the 1980s was bicycles on the streets and people dressed in Mao jackets, and stores didn't have, you know, all these fancy products. But intellectually, it was easily one of the most incredible moments in Chinese history. Yeah, I completely agree with you. The universities, Peking University, Nanjing University had real presidents. They really, you know, they run the universities rather than Ministry of Education. I don't know if people here know, in China today, if you are a PhD advisor in a university, you need to get approval from Ministry of Education for the PhD students you supervise. This is incredible, right? As a PhD professor, you don't even have the decision autonomy to decide who you supervise as your PhD student. Totally different from 1980s.
We're technically out of time, but I'll take one more question.
We can take a few and then answer them together. Yeah.
I'll take 2, and then end that with Professor Wang's comments. I saw the lady's hand that yes, the one behind you. No, sorry. This second yes. And then over here to you, Jonathan.
Hi, Professor Huang. I'm a research associate from Center of Taiwan Studies. And actually, this is not my question. It's like a feedback, or like, because I wonder why there are so many political scientists in the U.S. Will focus on how Chinese local government are really active in promoting local growth, because they got more autonomy than pre reform era. But I just wonder, because I read Jim Owen is a very famous political scientist. Say when they started to do research in China, they were only allowed to do research in a very limited space, and the Chinese government will show them some very successful TVE, and not. I I wonder if this is the reason, like they probably got like limited resources to do their field work, and also like I wonder like if you can talk a bit more about like the development of the TVE. I think it is really against our like common wisdom. Is like because like textbook understanding is like a TVE is really successful because of the local government initiative and local government autonomy. Yeah, so they got like more financial leeway to do things they want to do. Yeah.
Before you answer, do explain what TVE is. Not everybody necessarily know. Jonathan, last question.
Sorry, Jonathan Fenby, Research Associate at SOAS. To go back to your central point, thank you for a fascinating talk. Do you think there's an awareness at the top, i.e. Xi Jinping, that the China model is unsustainable, as some of us have been arguing for a long, long time, for a decade or more before he took over? And is it politically possible to change it? Two major questions.
Yeah. So I will go to that question and then the TVE question. So I ended my 2008 book on an optimistic note, which turned out to be totally wrong. The reason I was optimistic then was I looked at the policies of Hu Jintao during his first term, and I was encouraged because they were talking about rural issues. There was a phrase at that time, what is 三农危机, right? 3 rural crises. And they began to establish sort of bare-bone social protection in the countryside. They waived the agricultural taxes. They also, one thing that many people don't know is that in the 1990s, they began to charge for basic education. So they waived the fees for basic education. So I thought that the second term of the leadership was going to continue on that path of policies. But then the global financial crisis happened. They drew a very different conclusion from the one that I drew, which is that you need to expand income rather than focusing just on GDP growth. They were in a crisis mode, and then they unleashed what is famously known as 4 trillion program, 4万亿 trillion program. That launched this incredible drive of technology, infrastructure, and highway building, high-speed railways. So I couldn't possibly know that that was the direction that they would take, right? So coming to your question, I think it's not just the current leadership. It is a prevailing view among Chinese policy and political elites that the way to grow GDP is more important than income. To grow GDP is more important than generating employment. And the way to grow GDP is technology. That is a deeply held view among Chinese policy and political elites. Xi Jinping is not the exception. He's not the exception. And many people, some of them Western educated, and have that view. It's a very, very widespread view in China. So kind of my way of thinking had no traction in China. And then people often pointed out, look at the GDP growth, so how can you say this model is not sustainable when the GDP growth is 8 or 9%, right? I couldn't really push back against that because GDP growth is, quite robust. But now I do believe now we are at an inflection point. And the difference that I would describe today as compared with previous eras is that Chinese political system requires extraordinarily high rate of the growth. One, to sustain itself, and the other is to sustain the policy programs that they have, right? So if you look at the Mao era, Mao didn't grow the GDP, but Mao didn't spend money on Belt and Road, didn't spend money on a lot of these incredible infrastructure programs. Deng Xiaoping era, China began to have very high GDP growth rate. Deng Xiaoping era government also spent a lot of money. So essentially, high inflows of resources were sufficient to finance high outflows of the resources. You are in an equilibrium. So during the Mao era, you have a low equilibrium, no resources, no expenditure. Now you have a situation where you have incredible difficulties in generating growth. And by the way, most people, not most people, but quite a few people believe that Chinese economy is not growing at 5%, right? Recently, a Chinese economist would argue that the growth rate is overestimated by something like 3 percentage points. So at the best, it's like a 2 percentage point growth. You don't have the fast GDP growth, but you still have these expenditure requirements, Belt and Road program, pensions, and all these things. That is not a sustainable situation. So I think the economic reality is as clear as you can be. But they only began to recognize that they have a minor problem only this year. Only this year, right? So in the recent economic conference, they began to talk about that. In July, they began to talk about that. But the policy model that they are embracing is still the old model. It is still mostly on the supply side rather than on the demand side. They do talk about the transfers, and I'm not against transfers, but this is the way to think about transfers. Transfers are about the government taxing somebody, transferring the money to somebody else. It is the role of the government there. What I argue for is that you shouldn't tax the household at that level in the first place, right? So let's not think about the transfers. Let's think about not taxing the household sector and not taxing the private sector so then they can generate more employment as a way to improve the income. That, to me, is the right policy model to go. TVEs, very quickly, township and village enterprises. These are low, local level enterprises. You're absolutely right that many economists, many political scientists believe that they were owned and operated by the townships and villages. I checked the official definition of that term, TVE. The official definition is super clear. The official definition is that TVEs are enterprises operating in townships and villages rather than owned and controlled by the townships and villages. Western academics have committed this massive error by confusing a geographic concept with an ownership concept. And the difference I already laid out in my presentation. Out of 12 million TVEs in 1984, 10 million of them were straightforward private sector enterprises, right? So in my own mind, the Chinese growth in the 1980s was powered by the TVEs, and it was powered by one of the most successful experiences in private sector development, possibly in human history.
Well, thank you very much, Professor Yasheng Huang. I'm afraid it is my duty to have to draw to an end the 6th WSD Handa Distinguished Lecture. I think you have, from the reactions you have seen, how much interest you have stimulated. Just let me remind everyone that you are all invited to a reception in the foyer just outside. I will bring the speaker out to the reception area where you will be able to engage with him in more questions that I was not able to allow you time to ask him. I will take him away at 7:30. So there will be over half an hour when you will be able to engage with him. Thank you very much. I look forward to seeing you at the reception. Thanks.